These are the oldest stories, online at oldeststories.net. Most people who are historically minded remember the year 753 as the year that the city of Rome was founded. At least as important, however, is the slightly later year of 745 BCE, the year the Assyrian Empire was reformed and, in a sense, refounded into what we now call the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Now, that is a grand and sweeping statement, but one I think is entirely justified. Without Tiglath-Pileser's reforms, for example, Christians would not have had the Septuagint. The New Testament would not have been written in Greek, to say nothing for it have been having radically different content. The Islamic conquests would have either been much slower or totally impossible, and nothing in Near Eastern history would be recognizable by the time the Mongols arrived. And I very much don't mean all of this in a butterfly effect sort of way. Tiglath-Pileser's reforms were necessary for the Assyrian Empire to grow into the regional force that it became, and the expansive Assyrian Empire was foundationally necessary for the subsequent Babylonian, Persian, and Macedonian empires. Without those, Near Eastern history would almost certainly have remained multipolar and richly divided among ethnic, linguistic, and political lines, barring the rise of some other singular historical figure. All that, however, is food for thought. Today, we're in the year 745, or thereabouts. The rise of the man with the name Tukulti-Apil-Esharra is deeply obscure, and all the more speculated on for its seminal importance. The name means, "My support is in the son of the Esharra temple," meaning he was personally dedicated to the god Ninurta. The Esharra temple is Ashur's holy house, and the Assyrians had decided that Ninurta, the action hero god, was Ashur's son. It's from the Bible, with the name transliterated into Hebrew, that we get the common modern name of Tiglath-Pileser, though note that even in scripture his name is spelled in multiple different ways. Tukulti-Ninurta is also a valid Assyrian name and means essentially the same thing, but it may have been out of favor because, of course, the most famous Tukulti-Ninurta had died by assassination after a quagmire in Babylon. And if Tukulti-Apil-Esharra was a throne name, as many think it would have connected himself through his personal god to the cult and temple of Ashur much more directly, and may have therefore been a political move to picking his name like that, the way that popes are always thinking ahead to what their pope name is going to be. Now, that said, it may not have been a throne name. We know from a fragment of a record that a certain official named Tukulti-Apil-Esharra was given a land grant by way of King Adad-Nirari III some 21 years after Adad-Nirari's death. Now, there's not enough to properly read from this land grant, but some suggest that this may have been Tiglath-Pileser, receiving some sort of belated inheritance from his father, Adad-Nirari III, upon reaching an age of adulthood, suggesting that he was born only just after his royal father had died and spent his early adulthood as a minor governor in the central region. However, it's also possible that the fragment that we have says nothing at all of the sort and is referencing someone else by the not uncommon name Tukulti-Apil-Esharra, and therefore we know nothing at all about Tiglath-Pileser himself before coming to the throne. We do hear that he claimed to have been the son of Adad-Nirari III, but theories range from this being literally true, and thus he was at least 40 years old when taking the throne and probably born just before Adad-Nirari's death, or he could have been a grandson of Adad-Nirari, though who his father would have been is hotly debated, or he could have just been making that all up and not actually related to the dynasty at all. Personally, even though it is rather tenuous, I favor the idea that he was the youngest son of Adad-Nirari, a man of the now 1,000-year-old Abbasid dynasty, and While unquestionably a usurper, he is at least one within the royal line, even if not properly in line for succession. This makes him, for those keeping score at home, the fourth son of King Adad-nirari III to wear the crown. But he's the only one who's going to do a respectable job of it. Tiglath-Pileser is, or calls himself, a scion of Baltil, which is a powerful and ancient name that appears to be strongly connected not only with the oldest core of Ashur, the city, which is where you usually see Baltil associated, but also with the most ancient and prestigious house or houses of the Assyrian polity. Baltil is sort of the core of antiquity beneath Ashur itself, you could say, and Tiglath-Pileser claims to be descended somehow from that line. Another consideration, though, is that we really don't know anything except the official story here, and we know little enough of that. There are plenty of people who think Tiglath-Pileser was completely illegitimate, coming to the throne purely through politicking and force of arms. Now, some of those people are the perpetual skeptics who reflexively distrust any ancient source, but there's also a suggestion that Tiglath-Pileser's son is somehow part of the house of Habigal, which some read as Hanagalbat, though whether that's patrilineal or matrilineal line, no one really knows, or if that even applies to Tiglath-Pileser and not just his son. I mean, the debates get pretty technical pretty quick, and anything deeper is basically unknowable until more documents are discovered. In any case, the point is that Tiglath-Pileser was not the heir to the throne, but he was not a complete outsider. Instead, he appears to have been a man well within the swirling storm of Assyrian politics in an era where collapse was looking like a very real possibility. And he was the sort of man to put together a solid and workable plan for turning everything around. In a way, he's quite a lot like Sarduri I of Urartu, a man with a plan and the competence to execute, who gathered a core coalition of the powerful around him in order to take over and reshape a region. It is great man of history material, and I find it hard to read this in any other way. There are, of course, still underlying systems involved. The climate is fairly neutral at this point in history, though notably rainfall is just starting to enter into a long-term downward trend according to modern climatological reconstructions. But at the moment, the broader world system of climate and trade and migration are all decently calm, which no doubt leaves the window better open for someone like Tiglath-Pileser to show up. Now, of his revolt itself, very little is known. The fighting surfaces in the royal record as having reached the capital of Kalhu in 746, though some would say it started in Kalhu in 746, and that dominates our only record of that year, indicating that this was the full force of the rebellion in swing by 746, and then, suddenly, Tukulti-Apil-Esharra is crowned king of Assyria in the second month of the year 745, right in time for a very busy year. We know that the two losers here were the former king, Ashur-nirari V, probably Tiglath-Pileser's brother, and of course the actual power behind the throne, the mighty, though quite old by now, Turtan-Shamshi-Illu. Many among the Assyrian nobility were winners in the sense that they backed the winning horse, and we assume that basically all the officials that we hear about during his reign were on Team Tiglath to one degree or another. But the only one we really know much about is Belharan Beli-Usur, who had been so prominent in the previous generations that he had founded a city in his own name rather than in the king's name, and then managed to fall so far that his name had been scratched out of various monuments, and now he's risen again, to the extent that his name will later be re-inscribed alongside his patron, Tiglath-Pileser. Bel-Haran-Beli-Usur is not going to be on the test. He's not really that important, but he is a marked example of just how tumultuous politics was in this time. Beyond all that, we know for certain that quite a lot was done in the very busy year of 745. So much, in fact, that we'll be looking at the new systems that are established in this year for many episodes to come. Governance structure changes, military changes, religious changes, artistic changes, and many more. All of these were couched, of course, in deeply conservative terms, as not reforms, but as returns to what had been done previously. And in some cases, that genuinely was the case. They were drawing on the fairly recent heyday of Ashurnasirpal and Shalmaneser, but also looking back to the older periods of the late Bronze Age kingdom that had itself in many ways been reborn under a great conqueror named Tukulti-Apil-Esharra. Other changes, however, may have been drawn from the wider world. The increased use of Aramaic was probably not a policy so much as a reality forced upon them, but things like the new methods of deportation may owe their origin to the example of Biai-Nili, the kingdom of Urartu to the north. Now, these changes must certainly have been centrally planned in the sense that Tiglath-Pileser must have come to the throne with these ideas in mind and was backed by people who knew about and supported this package of policies. Politics in this age is still deeply personal and tribal. We shouldn't imagine Tiglath-Pileser's coalition as being motivated primarily by policy reform. Rather, they're hoping to pick the winning side and extract spoils and a position after a victory. But the idea of returning good governance and a stronger kingship must surely have been a factor in the wider politicking that led up to the 745 revolution. At the very least, we'll see there are plenty who would stand to benefit from many of his policies in very direct ways. The consolidation of power must surely have begun prior to his coronation ritual in the capital city, but it continued for about 5 months afterwards. By the fall of 745, Assyria was again, to all outward and official appearances, united and strong, apparently quite suddenly restored to the fullness of its former unity and glory. Sure, there are still some officials and governors that we'll encounter later that still need to be brought into line, and surely there must be more implementation required on a lot of Tukulti-Apil-Esharra's ambitions, but he has enough together now that he needs to embark on his inaugural expedition, the military campaign that will demonstrate his fitness as a steward of Ashur's kingdom and a favored hero of the gods. That expedition would take him south into the chaotic lands of Babylonia, and result in the restoration of record-keeping that will persist until the fall of Nabonidus 200 years later. When we last left poor Babylon, its kings had just offended Shamshi-Adad V back around 780 BCE. Shamshi-Adad had responded with a pretty astonishing, even by Assyrian standards, an astonishing destruction and sack of major Babylonian cities, leaving no king in Babylon, and really leaving what seems to have been a time of widespread, chaotic, post-apocalyptic anarchy. Now, how long that anarchy lasted is a matter of debate, but at some point in all this, it seems that the Chaldeans, a Western Semitic group that had arrived in the region some centuries earlier, came out of their homes in the southern Sealand swamps and moved into the cities to take control over them. An important figure in this Chaldean movement seems to have been a guy named Eriba Marduk. We have no contemporary records of him, but a later Babylonian history remembers him with a mixed record. On the one hand, he brought a measure of stability to the region for a time. On the other hand, that stability was brought by a heavy yoke and the destruction of his enemies, possibly even the annihilation of ancient cities like Uruk. What little we can guess of his policies seems to be that he decided some areas, like Babylon and the northern cities, were still valuable and so should be heavily taxed, while other cities, like the ancient Sumerian cities, were drains on resources, the rivers having long since flowed away and maintaining the temples being too expensive. And possibly, maybe those cities were backing the wrong leaders, and so they were destroyed and abandoned. Now, these first Chaldean kings appear to have been fairly disrespectful to the Babylonian gods, and this marks a first in Mesopotamian history. It's not that the Chaldeans, these first original Chaldeans, were impious. Most likely they had their own Chaldean gods and little attachment to the local deities, which would have seemed quite a lot like impiety to the Babylonians, who of course cared little for Chaldean gods and cared quite a lot for their own. Erebor-Marduk's impiety was not an aggressive sort, it was rather the detachment that let him abandon ancient temples in towns that he wasn't interested in maintaining. Still, for all that he wasn't a terribly nice guy, he is remembered as the one who established the foundations of Babylon after a period of total anarchy. His reward for that was to be murdered by a complete psychopath. If Erebor-Marduk has a mixed reputation, Nabal-Shuma-Ishkun, his successor, is remembered as an entirely evil figure. The only history that we have on his reign, likely written a generation or two later, is called The Crimes and Sacrileges of Nabal-Shuma-Ishkun. He was also a Chaldean, but not of the same tribe as his predecessor, and there are strong indications in the fragmentary parts of the text that he murdered his way to his power. He blasphemed regularly against the gods, canceling major religious parades and shortening religious holidays. He even, for no reason but sadistic atheistic impiety, defiled the Izida temple dedicated to Nabu by forcing the priests to eat leeks on days when it was prohibited on the ritual calendar. Which, it sounds a little bit silly, but it is in their minds the equivalent of forcing Muslims or Jews to eat pork. It's certainly an offense to religious sensibilities, whether or not you consider any greater harm to have been done. What's more, however, is that he seems to have revoked or significantly reduced the tax exemptions for Babylon and other major cities, forcing them both to pay taxes and participate in corvée labor. This was naturally resisted, and Nabal-Shuma-Ishkun ended up getting his way by burning down parts of the city. He burned 16 rebel Cutheans alive in public, imprisoned and killed political opponents without just cause, sold off Babylonian citizens as slaves to other nations in exchange for alliances with neighbors and important trade partners, and in a curious reversal of the common deportation policy, he pulled city folk out of the cities and forced them to live among the nomadic Semites, attempting to integrate them into pastoral life. And then he renovated the Esagila-Marduk's temple, and as part of that restoration, he put his foreign Semitic gods in alongside Marduk himself. All in all, he could quite charitably be described as a man with a plan in a severe and unforgiving circumstance. Babylon was in bad shape and needed radical reforms. The tax exemptions severely weakened the capacity of its governments in the absence of a wider empire, and there were multiple interest groups and power factions vying for dominance. Importantly, as we see in the legend of Era and Isham covered some time ago, There seems to have been a widespread belief that the chaos in the world may have been the results of the chaos in the heavens, and that perhaps even the traditional gods of the Mesopotamians had either abandoned or failed their people, while the gods of the Semitic peoples had brought their own people a degree of prosperity. By pivoting to these new gods, ending tax exemptions, cutting expenditures, and harshly suppressing enemies, Nabu-Shuma-Ishkun may have been a ruthless man attempting to force a bad situation into line with his wider vision. In that way, he might have been a man in the mold of Sarduri of Urartu and Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria, the main difference being that for all his energy and vision, he seems to have failed. If there were improvements, they were forgotten in the wake of the wretched costs that he imposed on the nation in pursuit of a restored empire. Also, he may well have been genuinely cruel and impious, as the later accounts suggest. For all that the document about his crime is undoubtedly propaganda, none of that means that it's necessarily false. Now, in 748, or perhaps 747, Nabu-Shuma-Ishkun was killed by a local Babylonian noble named Nabu-Nasir. Note the prevalence of Nabu names indicating just how important and prominent this god was in the south at this point. He's the god of scribes as much as anything else, and it's a reminder how closely tied Babylonian power and prestige is with their literate class. Anyway, Nabu-Nasir was a man who promised the same sort of religious restoration that Tiglath-Pileser was promising up north at basically the same time. And it's not beyond imagining that there was a wider cultural movement throughout Mesopotamia promoting conservatism and order, promising dramatic reforms to restore the stability and prosperity of previous generations. He would, as it turns out, prove to be historically significant. When the Greeks wrote histories of Babylon during the Hellenic period, Nabu-Nasir, Hellenized as Nabonassar, would be the first king whose name they remembered in their Hellenic kings lists, making him something of the founder of Babylon in the memory of later generations. Now, we'll see more of him later, but in 745, he's still struggling to gain control over his core region. Even in the relatively nearby city of Borsippa, we see another power faction that's still independent and quite hostile. Tiglath-Pileser, meanwhile, has reformed his army, possibly from the ground up. Though our main account of this campaign is badly fragmented, it appears that Tiglath-Pileser viewed the continued disorder in the south as genuinely a bad thing, not just an opportunity for conquest and plunder. And indeed, he doesn't frame himself as having taken any plunder, only as having received gifts for his campaign. Which, of course, is probably the same basic thing, but it's a reminder that the Assyrians really do see Babylon as a place fundamentally different from all other foreign places in their world. It's more civilized, more sacred, it's more human and good. Anyway, the Assyrian army begins by marching south and deliberately passing by some northern Babylonian cities without damaging or threatening them, and then from there, possibly with the aid of local guides, goes out into the steppes to attack a huge number of separate Aramaean and Chaldean tribes. 18 tribes are listed, and the list continues into a broken segment, so there was surely more than even that. In other scattered records, we have as many as 35 different Aramaean and generally Semitic tribes who were opposed to Tiglath-Pileser. And they're not presented as having been in a coalition and broken in a single battle. Rather, the Assyrian army is perhaps splitting up to tackle these threats individually, crushing the anti-civilizational forces threatening Nabu-Nasir's restoration of order down in the south, and threatening the southern border of the newly resurgent Assyria. In the Babylonian Chronicle, Tiglath-Pileser is accused of stealing a native Babylonian god, but in the Assyrian writings, the king insists that, yeah, he did take a god, but he dressed it all up and made it all fancy before returning it, and goes to great lengths to emphasize the extent to which he respected the native Babylonian peoples and traditions as he focused his campaign primarily upon the Aramaeans. Tiglath-Pileser ends up taking over some of the northern cities of Babylonia, including Sippar and Dur-Kurigalzu, and a lot of the former Kassite areas to the northeast. But he doesn't describe this as a conquest. Rather, he just sort of picks up the responsibility of administration here. No violence or force is reported. Right away, he gets to work improving their temples and digging new canals. The only deportations reported are tens of thousands of captured Aramaeans to various Assyrian provinces. But even these, both the Aramaean captives and the Babylonian citizens, he claims that he treated them as equal to his own Assyrians. We have a letter written from some point during his reign to the Babylonian leadership in the name of the king, and its tone is striking. The letter is unclear what conflict is being mentioned. It could be the 745 battles or certain events near the end of Tiglath-Pileser's reign, but whenever it was, it reads, "The king's word to the clergymen, the congregation, the leaders of Babylon, and to the citizens of Babylon. I am well. Assyria is well. You can be glad. Don't be afraid because of the news you heard. Watch the city, seize the streets, and take care of yourself. Now I am approaching you again, since the bodyguard Nadi-Ilu told me they are trembling in fear. Bel and Nabu-No and the great god himself knows that verily, when I previously heard that your brothers were killed, for 3 days nobody entered into my presence. My heart broke. Now you are afraid again. Bel and Nabu know indeed that there is no fault of yours. You can be very glad. Let your guard be strong until I arrive." So very benevolent and reassuring. While no doubt there was always a degree of iron beneath the gloved fist of Assyrian handling of Babylonian affairs, there was a genuine sense of connection, at least from the Assyrians towards the Babylonians. It's going to inform a lot of the drama over this next dramatic century and a half, but it should never be forgotten that it comes from a place of real attachment and respect and fondness for Babylonian culture and people. The Babylonians themselves, it should be noted, would remember this phase of their history with a degree of awkwardness, their desire to avoid Assyrian domination being tempered by a recognition of their cousinship. If anything, that might have only increased the bitterness of the subsequent fighting. But with the completion of this 745 campaign, Tiglath-Pileser very generously took charge of the northern reaches of Babylonia. And this is the first time we see one of his key reforms. He didn't make this land into a tributary kingdom with vassal lords to be managed and handled. That remodel had repeatedly fallen apart in Assyrian history. To be sure, they will continue to prefer to rely on vassal kings for numerous reasons when they can. It's just so much administratively easier to establish and maintain during any period that the vassal is not in open revolt. But the Neo-Assyrian Empire is going to rely on vassalage a lot less than its predecessors had. Instead, far more territory is going to be annexed directly into the empire proper, the Mat Ashur, the holy and beloved territory of Assyria. And there's a lot to be said about this change. It's been a while since we discussed it, but the economics of the Assyrian Empire up to this point were bifurcated in a way that produced interesting incentives for the king in particular. Generally speaking, most tax revenues within the Mat Asher went to governors and temples only, and thus funded internal development primarily, while income from outside the Mat Asher, whether tribute from vassal kings or plunder from conquest, went to the king, funding further conquests. It doesn't seem like the sort of thing anyone planned, just the result of various historical circumstances, but it is a curious pattern that helped the empire to snowball when it was strong, but also made it harder to break out of the declining spiral. At some point in this early Neo-Assyrian revolution, however, the king's share of regular taxation is going to increase noticeably. Now, this extra income is needed in order to further professionalize the army. Tiglath-Pileser seems to have come to power without mass levies in his army, just a paid professional corps, and after becoming king he retained his strong preference for an expanded professional army, even at great cost. Now, of course, Tiglath-Pileser is going to double the size of the empire over the course of his reign, so he will have both tribute and plunder income, as well as these new taxes to help pay for his vast army. But all this new taxation will come to chafe the people of the empire to a degree that it had not seen before. For all that these reforms are enabling the Assyrian resurgence, they're also already planting the seeds of their ultimate defeat. In all phases, Assyrian rule was characterized by a position of benevolence towards the ruled, both native and newly conquered. It can be striking how quickly Assyrian kings go from ordering the mass enslavement and public torture of an entire city to considering them sons of a loving father or beautiful plants in a garden. But in previous ages, this patronizing tone probably seemed all the more benevolent for being paired with modest tax rates. After Tiglath-Pileser, levies are far more often described with adjectives like crushing, devastating, or punitive, which surely won fewer hearts and minds. But of course, as long as the fear of the Assyrian army was greater than the fear of Assyrian taxes, they'd be able to maintain control and fund their great empire. Of note in this Babylonian campaign is that he marched down in August or October of 745, which, is nice for avoiding the summer heat, and this delay was probably necessary for him to organize matters after his coronation. But campaigning in the off-season, when most other kingdoms have their men busy planting, or in the spring during harvests, this is the advantage of the professional army, the ability to be active year-round, and thus more responsive to their needs. But also to hit when the enemy is less able to respond, to hit when it'll do more economic damage, encouraging more surrenders just to avoid conflict altogether during these critical seasons. We'll look later at the equipment and training of an Assyrian army, but solely by virtue of their professionalism, each man is better trained and equipped than the average opponent. Add to that the tactical innovations of Assyria, and each army unit can expect to be more effective than nearly all enemy army units. And despite having better units, made up of better soldiers, led by highly skilled captains and generals, attacking at times most opportune for the Assyrians, and able to reduce or neutralize defenses thanks to their engineering auxiliaries, No. Despite all that, it's still typically Assyrian policy to make sure they also outnumbered their enemy in any battle where that was possible. Against foes like the Aramaean tribesmen in Babylonia, who fought with little more than ferocity and a lifetime of warrior spirit, whole wars could be won with a minimum of casualties this way, overrunning the enemy quickly and efficiently, allowing more conquest in each campaign and more campaigns in rapid succession. It may seem unpleasant that they expended so many lives and resources in order to be the best at violence, but the ancient people knew well that being worse at violence is always more expensive than being the best. Now, at this point in history, I think Nabu-Nasir, who has been king of Babylon for only 3 years, knew that he was not the best at violence. For all that the city of Babylon retained its ancient and learned traditions, the wider region of Babylonia was well into decline beyond just the chaotic political situation. Dust-choked old roads and the rivers had shifted course, causing old cities to dry up. New settlements were founded along the new watercourses, but at a much slower rate, and without the benefits of centuries of established infrastructure supporting them. The Babylonia of 745 is less populated, less dense, drier, and more wild than it had once been, and the new Babylonian king's only real power centers are in urban areas and the towns directly dependent on them. The Assyrian attack into Babylonian territory was not, as far as we know, objected to in any official sense, and Nabu-Nasir probably knew he lacked the ability to object. But Tukulti-Apil-Esharra's Assyrian army focused primarily on enemies common to all civilized peoples, and did the South a favor by intervening so decisively, even if he did end up taking a pretty extensive chunk of territory in compensation. It was all a complex and difficult situation for Babylon, and Nabu-Nasir is navigating it as well as he can. It likely helped that he's positioning himself, like Tukulti-Apil-Esharra, as an ally of order against chaos and corruption. But even with Assyrian friendship and Nabu-Nasir's victories in the region, Babylon will be limited in its ability to control its own territory for quite a while going forward. With order restored to the south, 2 new governorships are created to reward his partisans, and his military reforms have been proven in battle, so Tiglath-Pileser returned for the New Year festivities of 744, ensuring that the coming year would be named for him. The main priority diplomatically, politically, and strategically is the collapsing Western Front. But Tukulti-Apil-Esharra knows that the empire isn't ready for that fight yet, even if the army probably is. The hostile Eastern Mountains are his next target. The campaign proceeds in 3 phases to match the 3 primary objectives. First, they come off the Diyala River to attack various towns in the lands of Namri. Namri had long been an Assyrian province, but some or all of it had fallen to rebels, and a major city apparently needs to have fire rained down upon it, and fire was kindly provided by the Assyrian army. And then that city is rebuilt fairly extensively and made headquarters for a eunuch governor of the newly reorganized Namri province. More on eunuchs later, believe that. This rebuilt city was probably populated heavily with relocated Assyrians from the heartland, while the survivors among its former population were deported en masse to various parts of the heartland. From this new base, the army moves deeper into Parsua, the central Zagros Mountains, where numerous peoples and kings are encountered and defeated. So poor is our understanding of this region at this time that we can't precisely place any of the many place names on offer, though we can note that there are a good mix of Akkadian, Iranian, and Median names among the list, telling us we're in a quite diverse region. The army is dominant in each battle, but this is not a place where Assyrian rule has ever held firm, so Tukulti-Apil-Esharra tries something new, showing off the flexibility of his reform package. Instead of leaving these defeated peoples as vassals of the king, which has never really stuck, He doesn't want to try integrating them into the standard bureaucracy of the provincial system. They're just too mobile for that. Tiglath-Pileser instead establishes a Parsua province with a unit governor, but then makes the local tribesmen into vassals of the governor. Now, is this an attempt to replicate the success of the Biaynili schemes to integrate the nomads of the Armenian highlands? We don't know enough about either program to say much about the administrative details or comparative approaches, but it does seem like Assyria is willing to note where their northern rival has been successful and are not too proud to take inspiration from there. Now, in the end, this Assyrian pilot program doesn't, from our vantage point, appear to have been successful, and the region never truly seems to calm down and submit for any significant amount of time, but it is interesting to see that they're trying. Now, the third step in this campaign would see the Assyrian army reaching deep past the expansion of Urartu into the lands of the Manaeans. These were an only somewhat more organized and developed mountain peoples, but straddling the development ladder between nomad and settled meant that they did have a bit of the best of both worlds. The Manaeans were defeated, plundered, and subdued, but there was likely no expectation that they would be long part of the fabric of the empire. Instead, this strike was a warning for the mountain peoples that the strength of Assyria could once again reach even this deeply into mountain strongholds. Tiglath-Pileser has his eye on Urartu, even as he prepares for his western campaign, and he wants to make sure that when he moves against his northern neighbor, currently King Sarduri II, that Sarduri isn't able to bring in allies from the distant east while his armies are busy in the west. Economically, though, this is one of the later great eastern expeditions. We're going to see fewer and fewer of those as time goes on. Yes, the east remains a source of horses, but Tiglath-Pileser has established an entire administrative department headed by a highly ranked official whose sole purpose seems to be the acquisition of horses, mostly through trade and tribute, which goes a long way towards relieving what had been the most persistent logistical pressure for the empire ever since the introduction of cavalry. Cattle, sheep, and goats are also listed as tribute from these people, but while there is value in livestock, it's not like the ancient world was particularly short on animals just in general. But the biggest change is that making these mountain routes less valuable, the biggest thing that's happening really isn't anything that Tiglath-Pileser or the Urartians or the Manaeans are doing directly. Instead, it's the widespread adoption of camels in the Iranian regions, particularly over the last half-century or so. You see, the Zagros Mountains and northern Iran had been key trade lines from Central Asia and India into the Near East for forever. They were moving metals and precious stones and other exotic valuables, at least since the early Bronze Age, if not earlier. We already looked at how Urartu had extended itself deep into northern Iran in order to secure some of this trade and deny it to the Assyrians. But at the same time, these trade flows are withering away up in those northern mountains. Total volumes of trade flow from Central Asia and India into Mesopotamia seem to be as significant as ever, possibly even greater. But the trade is now flowing over the hard southern deserts, a route that's only now possible thanks to camel-based caravans. The records of this era know about Bactrian camels and Arab camels, and the two appear to have entered service in the region about the same time from both the east and the west. And the upper and central Zagros Mountains are going to start getting more and more neglected by the greater empires, while the trade lines of southern Iran are going to help connect Elam, which is currently surging into its last gasp of civilizational strength. It's going to connect them more closely with the Mesopotamian empires. Now, in this wider scale of things, we can already see the coming Persian Empire taking shape, or where it will take shape. It'll be into this vacuum that the Medes and then the Persians will be able to establish themselves in those northern and central mountains, while the wealth of this new trade line is going to line up much more nicely with the civilizational and strategic path of the great empires of the age, finally once again running from Elam up through Mesopotamia to the Levantine cities, and it's going to flow much more freely than when trade had to flow over the mountains. But all this and more is on the horizon. We leave our story here for today at the end of the year 744, as Tiglath-Pileser is finally ready to turn his attention westward. The kingdom of Arpad is our target, but more than anything, it's the pivot point between two empires. So join us next time for the first great battle of the Neo-Assyrian Empire and its fallout that would reshape the entire face of the Levant. Thank you for listening.